Thank you, Rabbi Liberov. Judges are not really accustomed to sort of celebrity introductions. Normally, it's a much more staid and slow introduction. Can I begin, though, by acknowledging Rabbi Liberov as the host for this evening, and also the many shluchim who have come together and contributed to the making of this evening, and to thank them very sincerely for the privilege of being able to be here this evening and to speak. I particularly wanted to thank Rabbi Moshe Khan, who first invited me to speak. I've known Moshe Khan for a long time, and I've always known he was a very good operator. I did not appreciate how smart an operator he was until I came to understand that he had organized for me to speak when he wasn't going to be here. But nevertheless, he did send his apologies, and I'm very grateful for the invitation that he has extended to me this evening. I also want to acknowledge what appears to be a fair contingent of the Perth diaspora living in Melbourne. It's lovely to see you again, especially those who have been, in fact, and that's just about all of them, very closely associated with Carmel School. That is very dear to my heart, including our much missed, recently departed principal, Shula Lazar. Your gain, our loss, I'm afraid. Can I acknowledge also the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet tonight, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Might I begin by observing that I am very much not a natural choice of speaker for a Gimel Tammuz event. In Perth this last week, we had the good fortune and privilege of hearing Rabbi Ari Shishler from Johannesburg, a very eminent Chabad rabbi in Johannesburg, who is, I think, this weekend giving talks for Gimel Tammuz in Sydney, and on his way through, he spoke in Perth. And he gave a very uplifting, inspiring, and elevating talk, and reminded me of why someone like him and not me is probably the best person to be speaking for Gimel Tammuz. Because I'm not a very good storyteller. And even if I were, I don't really have any stories to tell. And that will become apparent. But nevertheless, I think what Rabbi Liberov said in his introduction is an excellent preface to the one story that I do have. And I have said it in a number of forums since last August, and I have some reticence about saying it because I have a natural reluctance when speaking about someone as great as the Rebbe to talk about myself. That's never a good thing to do. But I think some of the things that I have learned about in my own life are instructive. And I realized that when, after my appointment, a number of media outlets wanted to do interviews with me, and there was a particular chap, I'm sure a number of the shluchim here know this fellow, I can't remember his surname, his first name is Gary. Gary does a podcast called Lamplighter. Some of you may be familiar with it. And he was an NBC podcaster or journalist who did mainly sports-related podcasts. And with a reduction in public funding of the national broadcaster in the United States, he lost his job. He was close to Chabad and decided that there was a calling for him to do podcasts with different shluchim around the world or different stories of the influence of the Rebbe. And he rang me and said he wanted to do a podcast with me. I was happy to accommodate that. But it became pretty clear after about 10 minutes that I didn't have the stories that he was looking for, in the sense that There were no miracles. I can't tell stories of extraordinary occurrences. I don't doubt that they happened. They didn't happen to me, and they didn't happen directly to the people that I have knowledge of. And therefore, you're not going to hear tonight a series of extraordinary occurrences. In a sense, what makes me, and perhaps others, an admirer of the Rebbe, and of the view that the Rebbe was unquestionably the greatest religious leader of the 20th century, has nothing to do with stories about miracles. But it does have to do with the Rebbe's approach, not just to his Ahavat Yisrael, love of one's fellow Jew, but an extraordinary global vision for humanity that I don't think was shared by any other Orthodox leader ever, actually, not just the 20th century. And I really was forced to articulate that view earlier this year when I got a call from Rabbi Levi Shem Tov, who is the Shaliach in Washington, DC. And every few years they put on a big conference in Washington, in the Senate and government buildings, those that weren't at the time cordoned off for fear of another uprising. But he was hastily putting together a conference that the opportunity arose to do because the COVID restrictions had been rapidly lifted in Washington, and he was hurriedly putting together this conference. And he wanted me to speak at the conference, and I asked him what he wanted to speak, what he wanted me to speak about. And he said, well, speak as a judge who learnt in the Rebbe's yeshiva. And so I turned my mind to what I could say, not just as another rabbi or another admirer or chassid of the Rebbe, but something that I thought was perhaps a little different from the message that might ordinarily be advanced. And I prepared that speech and gave it. I was asked to give actually a lecture in the Library of Congress, which was a very impressive building and very impressive surrounds. And there was a full audience in the Library of Congress. And I delivered what was essentially a lecture. I'm going to draw on that tonight, but I would like it to be a little more discursive, because if I think I just delivered a lecture, you would all be asleep very quickly in the warm environment on a cold Sunday night. So I am going to be a bit less formal than I would be in an address of that nature. And I want to begin with a story about my own journey. Not a word I like, but it's the word that everybody uses about themselves these days. About my own journey that I think reflects much of the Rebbe's vision for all of us, in the sense that I am one of hundreds of thousands of people who were touched by that vision. And as I said to people in Washington when they asked me, my two careers, that is, my rabbinic career and my legal career, each and of themselves are entirely conventional. Neither of them make for an interesting story at all. On the rabbinic side, I came to Yeshiva College as a high school student. I completed my high school in Yeshiva College. That was at the insistence of the Rebbe's Shaliach in Australia, Rabbi Groner, Oliver Sholem, who came to Perth occasionally, sat in my parents' lounge room and told them they needed to send their children to his school in Melbourne. And so my parents, a little bit insanely, did. And each of us went to high school, finished our high school in Yeshiva College, and my sister in Beth Rivka. I then stayed in Yeshiva Gedola, and I was on the track. So I finished school at Yeshiva College. I spent some years at Yeshiva Gedola. I then went to and continued my learning in Kfar Chabad in Israel. And then I had a couple of years in New York in 770, where I had a very unique privilege of learning in the Rebbe's proximity. I then went back to Perth and started my legal studies. I was teaching at Carmel School. And again, I had a completely standard career path in the law. I finished university. I went to a law firm. I went to the bar. I was appointed, I think in Melbourne, you still call it, you've reverted to the undemocratic title of Queen's Counsel. We're a little more progressive in Western Australia. We call it Senior Counsel. So I was appointed in Senior Counsel. And those who have some understanding of the legal profession, appointments to superior courts in Australia are normally from the pool of Senior Counsel. And I was appointed last year to the Supreme Court of Western Australia. And that is a very conventional path in the law to the court. And so of themselves, each of those journeys was entirely unremarkable. I think what is of interest to people, or apparently of interest to people, is the intersection of those two journeys and the fact that I continue to do both of them. And I think it is that intersection, again, another contemporary word, it is that intersection that I think owes much to the uniqueness of the Rebbe's perspective on the modern world. And there is a personal touch to that story, which I think has been printed in a couple of different publications. And I'll start the story and then come back to it after I speak about what is a much more important thing than my journey, and that is the Rebbe's vision. When I finished law school, I could no longer teach at Carmel School, which was really my love and passion, teaching kids, and frankly, still is. I still try and do that as much as I can on Sundays and on weekends. But I was in an office on St. George's Terrace. Those of you who know Perth know all the legal and commercial offices are on St. George's Terrace. And I finished my articles, was admitted to the profession, and I was really struggling with what on earth I was doing in this world, being a lawyer, advancing private interests, important interests, but nevertheless, I was plagued and haunted by the question of what was I doing for the Jewish people. After being plagued by that with sleepless nights for some time, I had a very close friend in Melbourne, the late Chaim Yu, Olav Shalom, and he knew that I was struggling with this. Those of you who know Chaim would know that he would have said this in fairly strident and blunt terms, and that was, "You've got a Rebbe, why don't you ask him?" To which I responded, "I'm not a Rebbe man," meaning I never asked the Rebbe anything. I asked the Rebbe for a bracha when I got married. That was about it. I do not have, again, stories of personal encounters with the Rebbe, even though I was there for some years. So I said to Chaim, "I'm not a Rebbe man, and I don't go in for the whole hocus pocus, miracle answers. Here's the answer to the rest of your life. I admire those who do, but that's not me." Chaim responded again with his fairly blunt and strident words. And then he got back to me and said that he wanted to assure me that if I wrote out my query, my dilemma, he would promise me that it would be considered by the Rebbe directly, And he got his brother-in-law, Yossel Gutnick, a personality I'm sure everybody here knows, to ring me. Yossel and his late father, Rabbi Chaim Gutnick, Oliver Sholem, was close to the Rebbe. And Yossel rang me and said, Marcus, put down your dilemma on paper. I know you're not into this stuff, so I want to tell you something. Don't go for the whole thing. The Rebbe can look at your handwriting and work out your life and your future. Tell him. Write down who you are, write down your background, write down what is troubling you, and put down options. And I promise you it will go in front of the Rebbe and he will give it consideration. There'll be no throwing of the dice, no tricks. That was an invitation I could not decline. And so I wrote out on 2 pages who I was, my situation, and I wrote about 8 options. And I told the Rebbe that what I really wanted to do was to stay in Jewish education. And option number 7 or something was to remain in the legal profession. I sent that off by fax in those days. Yossel rang me a couple of days later and said the Rebbe pointed to or circled, I can't remember exactly, the answer to remain in the legal profession and devote my spare time to chinuch, to education. When I got that answer, I have to say, recalling it now, it felt like a sentence because I did not really think that my life was destined to be a lawyer. I didn't think being a lawyer in St. George's Terrace, Western Australia, was really going to make any difference to the Jewish people. But as you can appreciate, if you ask a question like that, you've got to accept the answer. I'll come back to the end of the story once I've dealt with what I think is a message that the Rebbe gave the world, which is much bigger, infinitely bigger than my story, but nevertheless says something about what the Rebbe told me. And so at the risk of putting you all to sleep, I open up my file and come to the point where I had turned my mind to what it was as a judge of a court I could bring to a discussion or an understanding of the Rebbe. And then it struck me that actually the Rebbe played a very important role in the jurisprudence of Western civilization in a very public way, although his name is not associated with it. Everyone knew where it was coming from. And it's a critical aspect of Western society. And that is the separation of church and state. And you probably know that manifested itself in the Supreme Court cases about the public menorah lightings. Now, public menorah lightings now, from the White House to Canberra, Parliament House in Canberra, to even the crazy dictator of Russia, they all do menorah lightings. It's not even controversial. But 30 years ago, 35 years ago, it was extremely controversial. Why was it controversial? Why were there people, and in particular Jews, who were opposed to public menorah lightings? And make no mistake about it, the people at the forefront of opposition to public menorah lightings were Jews. All of that emanates from, and I'm not going to give you a lecture, you'll be pleased to know, on American jurisprudence in the American Constitution. But the American Constitution, it is important to understand, has a Bill of Rights. The very first words of the Bill of Rights say this: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So it has two limbs. No law respecting an establishment of religion, that's number one, and no law that prohibits the free exercise of any religion. That is the constitutional embodiment in the United States of the separation of church and state, a fundamental principle of the separation of powers and democratic values of the United States, and I might say also, for example, in other Western countries, including Australia. Australians don't get quite as upset about these things, but nevertheless, we have our own constitutional provisions that reflect, in broad terms, a similar approach. We're a bit more relaxed about its application, as Australians tend to be. There were a number of these cases that went through the courts in the United States. And the most important one was a case called the County of Allegheny and the American Civil Liberties Union of the Greater Pittsburgh Chapter. Now, what was the County of Allegheny? The County of Allegheny was a county in Pittsburgh, and they had a mayoral building and a courthouse, which was the seat of government. And every year, they put a Christmas tree in the courthouse and the county. I can't remember exactly the name. These buildings are particular names, but there's a government building and a courthouse. And then what happened is that in 1984 or 85, Chabad organized for a large menorah to be put up in the county building. Between the courthouse and the county building, which were in close proximity, there were 3 religious symbols that were erected for the festive season in December. The courthouse had a beautiful, magnificent staircase, which was the central architectural feature of the courthouse, as it often is in courthouses. The British were into staircases. And on the staircase, they placed a nativity scene. The manger, the baby, the angels. And then in the next building, the county government building, there was a 45-foot Christmas tree. And then I think a 20-foot menorah erected by Chabad. Can't remember the precise dimensions, but the Christmas tree was bigger than the menorah. That is the case. And there was a sign there saying, the County of Allegheny salutes liberty in this festive season, some such innocuous motherhood statement. The American Council of Civil Liberties took objection to 2 things: the nativity scene and the menorah. They raised no objection to the Christmas tree, interestingly, for reasons, and that's another discussion. The Council of Civil Liberties and other plaintiffs were all Jews. The lawyers on every side were all Jews. There is a fascinating, I only found this yesterday, actually. Chabad run this thing called Torah Cafe. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. There's a very talented chap, I now can't remember his name, I only looked at this yesterday, who did this amazing reproduction of the case. He got two lawyers, one who represented Chabad and one who represented the American Council of Civil Liberties, both Jewish, to his Chabad house somewhere in the United States and got them to present their arguments again as part of a CLE for lawyers. And it was filmed, it's on YouTube. I watched that, I watched that last night. And the Jewish lawyer for the American Council of Civil Liberties put up, I think, what is, certainly for lawyers, a very respectable argument. He was not the lead counsel. The lead counsel was a woman whose name was Littman, her maiden name was Margolis from Brooklyn. There was not a goy in the courtroom except the judges, okay? And at that stage, I don't think there were any Jews on the court. The proof is that the menorah was upheld as constitutional. If there'd been a Jew on the court, it would have been unconstitutional. And I say that as a bit of a gelächter. I mean, I say that that happens to be true, but the result of the case was bizarrely that the nativity scene was held unconstitutional and the menorah was held constitutional. And that is the product of the fact that there were different judges who took different views about different aspects of the case. And that's basically sort of what came out at the end result. I've read the case a number of times. Those of you who know Mr. Nate Lewin was the leading counsel for Chabad. He has also spoken about this case at length. You can find that on YouTube as well, about a 2-hour lecture on the case, riveting for lawyers. Not sure about anyone else, but the lawyer who they got, I think that Margolis woman has passed on. She's now in Olam Ha'emet, the ultimate Supreme Court. But the second counsel was a Jewish chap by the name of John Poshinsky. And I was interested in what he had to say because I've read this case many times and I hadn't seen this Torah Cafe video, which I watched last night. And he put it in this way. Government, the seat of the mayor, the courthouse, is where every citizen must attend to advance their rights. You don't have a choice. If you want to advance your rights, that is the avenue available and the only avenue available to you as a citizen to advance your rights or protect your rights. And you turn up there and you see the symbols of a particular religion on display in the courthouse. What does that say to the person who is turning to the court to protect their rights when they see that their religious symbols are not there and the majoritarian's religious symbols are displayed? What does that say to the citizen? It tells the citizen that they are not truly part of the polity. They are an outsider. And that is a message that should never be given to someone who comes to the seat of government or a court. That, I think, is a very persuasive argument. I think I'll put it more persuasively than John Poshinsky, actually, but it is the point I'm making is that it's not a silly argument. It's not an outrageous argument. And I want to read you from a couple of the passages from the justices of the Supreme Court. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, a famous justice, said this in the Algemene case. If government is to be neutral in matters of religion rather than showing either favoritism or disapproval towards citizens based on their personal religious choices, government cannot endorse the religious practices and beliefs of some citizens without sending a clear message to non-adherents that they are outsiders or less than full members of the political community. In another case, the Grand Rapids case, another interesting case about religious teaching, the challenged governmental action is sufficiently likely to be perceived by adherents of the controlling denomination as an endorsement and by the non-adherents as a disapproval of their individual religious choices. And there's quite a haunting passage from a judge, quite a colourful judge, not on the Supreme Court, but one of the state Supreme Courts, Justice Frank Easterbrook, a very interesting judge. Some of you may have heard of him. This relates to a nativity scene in City Hall in Chicago in 1985. A suit was brought by the American Jewish Congress to have the nativity scene declared unconstitutional. Justice Frank Easterbrook took quite a conservative view on religion. I won't go off on the tangent of explaining his view, but he explained in a colourful and powerful dissent, because he would have upheld the nativity scene. The court held that it was unconstitutional. The American Jewish Congress were victorious. But he said in the course of his comments, of his judgment, state compulsion of religion had spawned a long history of persecution in Europe. He said it has been the source of oppression in many nations, that is, the mixture of government and religion. And our nation, that is the United States of America, was founded in part by those fleeing such religious policies of other governments. He went on to observe this: the establishments of Europe and the states were riddled with compulsion. Compulsion to pay church taxes, compulsion to attend church, compulsion to attend the tenets of the chosen creed, that is Christianity, oaths and disqualifications for office for those who were not Christians. And I say that because I want everyone to understand how the consensus in the Jewish community, not only in the United States, but throughout the Western world, was that the Jewish community need to be the scrutineers, the cheerleaders, to ensure the separation of church and state. Now, I hope I've persuaded you that separating church and state has a very sound basis. Having explained that to you, I invite you, well, I pose the question: which Jewish religious leader in their right mind would have advocated for the diminution or the weakening of the separation of church and state? There are no prizes for getting the answer to that question. The answer is the Rebbe. But that only begs a bigger question. How could a man born into European civilization, whose own family, community, and people were destroyed brutally by the continent that did not observe the separation of church and state, become the advocate for not its abolition, but certainly for its weakening in the United States and in the Western world? And when I looked into the jurisprudence of the United States Supreme Court and the history of the menorah battles, and it wasn't only the menorah battles, by the way, the Rebbe was advocating this in the 1960s with a moment's silence in public schools for all children to be required to have a minute of silence to ponder life in the hope that they might ponder their own creation and thereby a creator. That was declared unconstitutional. It was called the Regent's Prayer. But it only begs the question: how does a man with that background come to the view, against the very strong consensus of the Jewish community of the Western world and the United States in particular, that we should take action which will undermine the separation of church and state? And that is the question that interested me the most when I was asked to speak as a judge in Washington. Again, I'm not going to give a lecture on constitutional history, but the separation of church and state had quite a lengthy history in the United States Supreme Court. A case called Lemon and Kurtzman set down a three-pronged test. A law or practice, to be permissible, must have a secular purpose. It must not advance nor inhibit religion in its primary effect. And it must not foster an excessive entanglement with religion. Interestingly, I hadn't appreciated until I heard John Pashinsky yesterday that one of the ACLU's arguments against the menorah was not only was it a religious symbol and crossed the red line of government endorsement of a religion, but it also constituted an excessive entanglement with religion because the court was buying into an internal dispute within the Jewish community, because there were many Jews, including religious Jews, who did not consider this appropriate. And for the court to make a decision about it was an entanglement with the religious community and thereby impermissible, because there were Jews and there were plaintiffs in the action who gave evidence that they were offended religiously by the proximity of the menorah and the Christmas tree and what they considered to be the cheapening of a sacred ritual. And by choosing to uphold the menorah, the court was entangling itself in internal religious affairs of the Jewish community. The way I've put it here and the way I put it in Washington, I'm going to read because I cast this carefully. The man who rejected the conventional and perfectly understandable stance of the Jewish community was a man who himself was a product par excellence of European Jewry. The very community that for centuries had suffered so horrifically from the failure to separate the exercise of state power from religious doctrine, and a man whose own world and family had been the brutalized victims of state discrimination against his religious community. Just to round off the story about the case, before I get back to the Rebbe's vision. There were judges who held, they were both the menorah and the nativity scene were unconstitutional. There were judges who held they were both constitutional. There were judges who were split depending on context and the particular symbol. In the end, there were 9 judges, 6-3 in favour of the menorah, 5-4 against the nativity scene. So working through what every judge said and how you get to that ultimate outcome is like unpicking a Gemara, lahavdil. It's a very, very difficult exercise. I come back to the question of why. Why did the Rebbe adopt that position against the Jewish community, the conventional mainstream Jewish community? And again, I chose these words carefully, so I'm going to read them. And I preface them by saying that, truthfully, I've got no idea of the answer to that question, because my pea-sized brain compared to the Rebbe's brain and soul can only but advance conjecture about the reason. But having posed the question, I think I should give you an answer. Whether you find it satisfying or whether it's correct or not, it's an entirely different matter. The Rebbe's focus, from what I could tell, was not only the Jewish people. It was humanity. in accordance with the biblical tradition, was created in the image of God. And this is the extraordinary thing. The Rebbe was more concerned with the threat to humanity of rampant materialism, of the corrosion of community through a godless individualism, than he was concerned by a threat to the Jewish people from a government's benign endorsement of religious symbols and principles. The Rebbe perceived a far greater danger to society in suppressing the expression of faith from the public sphere than in giving a public civic voice to religious belief. Now, let us pause to ponder that remarkable phenomenon. Here was a man whose family, community, and civilization were annihilated by a continent that had exemplified the sickening consequences of the failure to separate church and state. Yet his sight pierced beyond that horror of his own experience to see the divinity within humanity, such that he was able to promulgate a global vision beyond the plight of his own people. It was a vision that beheld a more pressing threat: the disempowering and marginalization of those who, without being coercive, seek to elevate society with a public call to appreciating God's providence and humanity's sacred role as having been created in God's image. For the Rebbe, that was the surest, indeed perhaps the only way to seek to create a less selfish, a less materialistic, a less brutal, and a better, more godly world. And in that, the Rebbe was, I think, projecting anew the message of Judaism for the whole of humanity, for a global community. In the Rebbe's native Europe, the marginalization of Jews had really, in a sense, created ghetto walls that prevented a global message emanating from Judaism. And all of us my age, I think, grew up with much of that, us and them. The beleaguered Jew, the establishment powerful Gentile. It is beyond extraordinary, in my respectful view, that a man could climb out of Europe, of pre-Holocaust Europe, and see beyond the us and them to find divinity in the whole of humanity. To me, beyond any story, beyond any miracle, that is simply remarkable. The Rebbe gave a message of spiritual empowerment that transcended the us and them, Gentile against Jew, the message of his native Europe. He gave a message that the aspiration for the spiritual, for the godly, may, indeed must, legitimately find its expression in the public space. For the Rebbe, the exclusion of that voice from the public sphere was, in our time, the more grave threat to society's moral compass. There were many responses to the great evil that befell the Jewish people in the first half of the 20th century. And no one, particularly in the Melbourne Jewish community, needs to be told that by me. Many sadly abandoned their Jewish identity, some quickly and deliberately, others subtly and gradually, over 2 or 3 generations as they gradually adopted the seductive materialism and secularism of their new environments. Many others were inspired to turn to the necessary empowerment of the Jewish people through the miraculous rebirth of Jewish nationhood and sovereignty in Eretz Israel, the ancient homeland of the Jewish people. Still others rebuilt traditional Jewish life in their new homes, Sometimes, as we see in Melbourne, in the United States, flourishing, self-contained Jewish communities living intense religious lives without ghetto walls, but inwardly focused to rebuild that which was destroyed. The Rebbe's response was in its time unique and unconventional. It was not limited to political empowerment or the rebuilding of religious communities, vital though those endeavours were. The Rebbe's primary vision audaciously rejected the rational and understandable and perfectly reasonable position of the establishment Jewish community, which perceived the separation of church and state as sacrosanct. The Rebbe's vision and message was to respond to humanity's most evil hour by empowering the public expression of faith, empowering the public and brazen expression of the goodness of humanity created b'tselem Elokim in the image of God, to call brazenly and publicly for a less selfish, a more just, a more kind, a more godly world. Or in the words of the Hebrew prayer we say 3 times a day, L'taken olam b'malchut Shaddai, to heal the world with the sovereignty of the Almighty. And in the Rebbe's vision, even for those whose conscience could not, in the Rebbe's view for the time being, reconcile with any religious faith, there remained great value in encouraging the public expression of the sanctity and divinity of humankind as a means of fostering a kinder and more caring world. Tragically, the world does not appear to be heading in that direction today. That is all the more reason, perhaps, to give ear to the Rebbe's message that the real threat to humanity lies not in the expression of faith in the public sphere, but on the contrary, in society's loss of belief in the divinity that lies within all of us, that mandates mutual respect and responsibility. Perhaps, indeed, we need more public and brazen symbols that call attention to that message. And the Rebbe's message in relation to faith in the public sphere has no longer passed into history. There are still those who are very discomforted by it. I Googled to see any contemporary comments about that. And I encountered a comment by an American religious leader. Now, I wrote it out here, but it seems to have disappeared since I wrote it. It was there this morning. And that was by a Reform rabbi, a religious leader, who was an admirer of the Rebbe, but who said the Rebbe's challenge to church and the separation of church and state was discomforting, and it was done in a brazen and in-your-face way. I think that's a very fair criticism in the sense that it's a fact. The Rebbe was brazen, and the Rebbe's message was in your face. Whatever you think of Chabad Shluchim, you can't ignore them. They're in your face. Because that was the Rebbe's. The Rebbe was all for peaceful, pleasant engagement. But if the world needed brazen, in-your-face action, that is what he did. So I come back now to the far less significant aspect of my own life. In an obscure and far-flung corner of the globe, I mean, you can imagine saying this in Washington. Half of them never heard of Australia. Melbourne, Sydney, kangaroo. They're the three words they knew. If you tell them there's something, I mean, there are some Melbourne and Sydney people that have never heard of Perth, but try telling people in Washington, DC that you're from Perth. I think we became more famous during COVID, actually. Let's not start that. So as I said in Washington, in an obscure and far-flung corner of the globe, on the western edge of a sparsely populated continent way down under. When I finished my law degree, I turned to the Rebbe and I told that story in much briefer terms than I have this evening. The Rebbe told me to stay in the legal profession and devote my spare time to education, to chinuch. The end of the story, if you want to think of this as a miracle, I don't, but if you think this is miraculous, gesundheit, as they say, when my appointment was announced, they didn't ask me for a press release. Somebody in the Attorney General or the Premier's office would have been assigned the job of Googling or speaking to people. But the title that was announced by the Premier and Attorney General was Senior Lawyer and Educator appointed to the Supreme Court, which reflected, of course, what the Rebbe had told me to do, to stay in the legal profession and devote my spare time to education. So to me, that was a very uplifting rounding out of the story. But what it means to me isn't really relevant, other than for the fact that the Rebbe's answer is as obvious to me now as it was not obvious, but certainly clear then. And I hark back to what Rabbi Liberov said. It's not really about the stories of what the Rebbe did, but the way the Rebbe was able and what the Rebbe was able to get other people to do. And the Rebbe told me, why are you asking about two pathways? You can do both. The Rebbe extended his blessing that I would meet with success in both endeavours. But the important thing is this, I think. For the Rebbe, this was not a mutually exclusive choice between secular and religious alternatives. For the Rebbe, there was no such bifurcation of roles or purpose. There was no brick wall between church and state. On the contrary, this was an opportunity to pursue both, to demonstrate the compatibility of the undiluted expression of religious faith at the highest levels of contemporary professional environments. And in short, I think the Rebbe was calling on me, together with many of the other thousands of people he touched, to be part of his vision, to empower the expression and the practice of faith in the most public sphere of modern democratic society. And in that way, to be part of rebuilding a better humanity in the century following humanity's most disgraceful descent. And that, I think, is the Rebbe's answer to those who are intrigued by the intersection of the two spheres in which I operate. There is no intersection in the Rebbe's vision, because there are no conflicting or even separate paths or identities. There is simply a duty on each one of us in the public environment in which we find ourselves to demonstrate the compatibility of our public expression of faith with our civic and public lives. And by that unashamed demonstration, to strive for a fairer, more just, and more godly world. I think that's a lesson for every one of us. that, in my respectful and humble view, is one of the great legacies of the Rebbe, not just for our generation, but for the individual lives of every single one of us. Thank you very much for your attention.